So, Josh, you remember when we recorded the media diet, we had a certain section that we cut both for time and relevance?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, we were listing kind of a timeline and key points that, kind of connected some dots and illustrated a connection between Russian interference, the Trump campaign, and more specifically Rupert Murdoch, right? And his turning a blind eye, or even in some cases being quite complicit.
Yeah, and we cut it for two reasons. Time was one of them, and secondly, it really didn't have anything to do with the media diet. But I showed it to our mutual friend Brett, and he thought it might be interesting if we did a full segment on it.
Yeah, I love that idea because, Brett, for anyone listening, Brett, I look at Brett and I find him to be annoyingly pragmatic.
He pulls you back to the center, that's for sure.
He does. So he gave you some feedback on that section?
Yeah. He thought, if we air this content, it's important for people to hear. So from this point on is the material we cut. So have a listen. We're going to start with the history of Rupert Murdoch.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
and John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting.
So, listeners, as we started digging into this, there was so much data and so many articles and so many documentaries that we consumed in order to get this information together. So the best way to disseminate it was to index it and to categorize it and put it on a timeline. And what we're going to do is we're just going to read through that timeline. So, Josh, why don't you start us off with the first topic here?
Yeah, you bet. So the first thing I'm going to go over here is his history, Rupert's history. So Rupert Murdoch's father was a news publisher and owned a couple of newspapers in Australia. He owned the Herald, whose tagline was impartial but not neutral, not unlike the conservative magazine Human Events motto, which was mentioned in previous podcasts. After his death, a 21-year-old Rupert sold one of the papers and turned the other around and started acquiring other newspapers in the country. In 1968, he then moved to London. He quickly acquired News of the World and set to establish himself as a media force. The News of the World was a Sunday tabloid. It was mainly sex scandals, political gotchas, and celebrity news. Gossip. Later, Murdoch purchased The Sun, a reputable paper in London, which Murdoch turned into a tabloid and streamlined costs. This made him a media giant and earned him a great deal of revenue. News of the World was a sleazy paper which picked its victims and punished those who opposed it. It hired private investigators and ran stories against people who he considered against his organization. Michael Wolff of Fire and Fury fame stated in his book, The Man Who Owns the News, that Murdoch routinely would state or claim he has compromising information on people. In 1977, Murdoch, after moving to New York City and purchasing a paper in San Antonio, he then buys the New York Post, which is a slightly more political version of the National Enquirer. It regularly features Donald Trump and a lot of his antics. And the National Enquirer has also had an arrangement in the past with Donald Trump where he agreed to provide dirt on celebrities, politicians, and so forth, and in return, the Enquirer would run articles about how wealthy and successful he was. If this was an arrangement that Donald Trump pursued with the Enquirer, did he pursue the same arrangement with the New York Post? In 1987, Rupert and his conservative allies get the Reagan administration to stop enforcing the Fairness Doctrine. This leads to the advent of Rush Limbaugh and the right-wing media. Murdoch is on the rise. He starts Fox Searchlight Studios and Fox Network Television. He has a breakout hit with The Simpsons. In 1996, Rupert and his conservative allies once again lobby Congress to write a policy called the 1996 Telecommunications Act, wherein it legalizes radio companies to own multiple radio stations in multiple markets. It also allows newspaper companies to own a television station and a newspaper in the same local market. This gave birth to Fox News. Fox News immediately turned its cannon fire onto Bill Clinton. Though their pursuit of Bill Clinton ultimately turns up empty-handed, they learn through the process people love to hate Hillary. Fox spent the next 2 decades going after Hillary. Meanwhile, News of the World was known to have many phone company employees and law enforcement officials on their payroll.
Then, in 2005, a huge story breaks. Prince William makes a call and states to a friend's voicemail that his knee was injured while playing football. The comment was more of a joke among friends, but it gets reported in News of the World as fact. When Prince Charles followed up with William, it signaled to the royal family that it was from the messages William left. William's friend tells the prince he never received a voicemail from him. This leads the royal family to ask Scottish Yard to investigate. An editor who covers the royal family at News of the World, a man named Clive Goodman, gets indicted and sentenced to 4 months in prison for the phone hacking, as well as a private investigator who is sentenced to 6 months. News International, the parent company of News of the World, says it was all the actions of a rogue reporter. News International's chief executive is Rupert Murdoch's son, James Murdoch. News International executives deny multiple times that the hacking went beyond this one reporter and that he was acting as a rogue within News of the World. A total of 8 victims were identified in the investigation. Nick Davies, a reporter for The Guardian, sees an old friend at a social function. He knows he's a senior official with the police. He asks him point blank if it was only these few people that were affected by the hacking, or were there more? He responds that there were thousands of victims. A previously unknown victim settles out of court with James Murdoch in a huge payoff. The Guardian reports on all of this and tells the public that there were thousands of victims. News International goes after The Guardian. It accuses them of shoddy journalism and using unnamed sources and greatly misinforming the public. Executives of News International go on the record and say they can't recall all of the details and reinforce the claim that there was a single rogue journalist at News of the World. Meanwhile, many members of parliament and celebrities are being followed at the direction of News International. News International owns 4 newspapers and a major television station in the UK, and they're going up against a newspaper that stands alone in The Guardian. Alan Rusbridger calls Bill Keller of the New York Times, who is the executive editor. The New York Times decides to pick up the story and quickly gets 2 more sources. It explodes into an international scandal. Police reopen the investigation from 5 years previous.
In 2008, Rupert holds a private event on his yacht wherein he flies conservative leader David Cameron to attend. Also in attendance is well-known Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. Meanwhile, a revolving door seems to be swinging between Number 10 and News International, and employees of each are switching occupations. Guardian gets another scoop. Millie Dowler, a 13-year-old missing girl that took the nation by storm, turns out to have some connection to News of the World. Her story was run in both the News of the World and The Sun, both owned by Murdoch. The family was given hope that she was still alive due to the fact that they would call her and tell her they loved her and were not giving up on looking for her. They knew she was still alive because she was checking her voicemail. Well, she actually wasn't checking her voicemails. News of the World was checking her voicemail. This outraged the UK. New accusations of hacking come out from crime victims and celebrities. Murdoch flies to London to show solidarity with his chief editor at News of the World. Despite his support, his chief editor is arrested shortly after he stands by her. A parliamentary inquiry is arranged. Murdoch claims no responsibility and says something along the lines of, "It's only 3% of News Corp. I can't possibly know what goes on day to day." Police inquiry shows payment to police and bribes to government officials, commonplace for News of the World and The Sun.
2011, it emerged that David Cameron met key executives of News Corp over 20 times during the 14 months that Cameron served as Prime Minister. Murdoch convinces Cameron to hire Andy Coulson, one of News of the World's former editors who had resigned over the phone hacking scandal. Cameron agrees despite multiple warnings from advisors. Coulson later resigned and was arrested and charged as a result of the new investigation into the phone hacking scandal. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail. As outlined in a recent article by Jane Mayer of The New Yorker, Murdoch's staffing of both president's and prime minister's office is commonplace. She detailed that former Fox News president Bill Shine joined the Trump White House also as a communications director. Also from The New Yorker, Trump's rise to fame was largely pushed by Murdoch's operation at the New York Post. He was introduced to Trump by the legal fixer Roy Cohn. Mayer writes, quote, "Cohn saw the potential for tabloid synergy. Trump could obtain celebrity in the pages of the Post as a Playboy mogul, and Murdoch could sell papers by chronicling Trump's exploits," end quote.
Shine is only the most recent Fox News alumnus to join the Trump administration. Among others, Trump appointed the former Fox contributor Ben Carson to be his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the former Fox commentator John Bolton to be his National Security Advisor, and the former Fox commentator K.T. McFarland to be his Deputy National Security Advisor. McFarland resigned after just 4 months. President Trump recently picked the former Fox News anchor Heather Nauert to be the ambassador to the United Nations, but she soon withdrew herself from consideration, reportedly because her nanny, as an immigrant, lacked a work permit. The White House door swings both ways. Hope Hicks, Shine's predecessor in the communications job, is now slated to be the top public relations officer at Fox Corporation. Several others who have left the Trump White House, including Sebastian Gorka, a former advisor on national security, regularly appear on Fox.
New York Times reporter Jonathan Mailer and Jim Rutenberg said, quote, "Murdoch was deeply entwined with the Trump family. Trump had aggressively cultivated the Post during his rise to celebrity in New York in the late 70s and 80s, end quote. Jared Kushner became close to Murdoch after he purchased the New York Observer in 2006. An improbable friendship blossomed between the octogenarian mogul and the 30-something publishing parvenu, with Murdoch and Wendy even taking Kushner and Ivanka on vacation in the Caribbean on Murdoch's yacht. After Trump's election and after the UK votes in favor of Brexit, both issues largely pushed by Murdoch's operation in both countries, Murdoch begins to dissolve his organization. He sells Fox Searchlight to Disney for $51 billion, and he sells European broadcast company Sky Media to Comcast for $38 billion. Shortly thereafter, Murdoch taps one-term Speaker of the House Paul Ryan to join his newly formulated Fox Corporation's board of directors. He also gives former DNC chairwoman Donna Brazile her own show on Fox News Saturday. So you may have recalled seeing in the 2016 election, just when the Trump-Russia light just started to flicker, An article came out that said Ivanka Trump goes on vacation with Vladimir Putin's girlfriend. Do you remember seeing that?
Yeah.
It was like an Instagram post or something. Well, I read the article, and the woman that they're talking about is a woman named Wendy Deng, and she is Rupert Murdoch's third wife. Now, the source of this Vladimir Putin connection, I wouldn't really put a lot of faith in. It was reported by Us Weekly, which is a tabloid. No other agency confirmed this story. It's not like it was in, any like news publication. But what's interesting is that even if the source isn't reliable sources later on picked up that the FBI's counterintelligence group went to Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner and told them, hey, you should distance yourself from Wendy Deng. We believed her to be a Chinese counterintelligence operative. So Murdoch had left her, and this was widely reported as well. He had left her because it was rumored she was having an affair with former Prime Minister Tony Blair. So it's like, what are these people doing? So I think the next thing we have to look at is Putin.
Right, Putin and Russia.
Yep.
So with Russia,
in 1989, a KGB official in East Berlin sees the greatest defeat of his life when the Berlin Wall comes down. His name is Vladimir Putin. He vows to restore Russia to its former glory.
Putin works his way through politics, working for a mayor in St. Petersburg. His level of corruption is unparalleled. He uses intimidation and threats and makes off with millions from the people's budget. He builds a villa in Spain and lives large. Later, he makes his way to Moscow, where he becomes the administrator, kind of like chief of staff, for Boris Yeltsin. Putin is well connected with former KGB officials and runs a behind-the-scenes chopping block for Yeltsin's administration. He routinely fires Yeltsin's entire staff due to corruption, which really means that they were onto him and closing in, and replaced them with friends and former KGB members. He arranged fake trials for the former employees and sent many packing to other countries, or worse, imprisoned or even killed.
In 1999, Putin is made prime minister and Yeltsin remains president. But Yeltsin is ailing and a drunk, and he needs to hand the country off to a successor he trusts. Putin is largely unknown on the national level in Russia, hurting his chances. That year, 4 apartment bombings went off in Russia and killed more than 300 people.
This started the Second Chechen War, as Russia said they had reason to believe the Chechens were behind it. No proof was ever made public of that. Putin's handling of the attack launched him into national notoriety, and he's made president shortly thereafter. Many Western intel groups know the devices and types of materials in the blast were actually made by the KGB and used by the new state police, the FSB, which answers to Putin. Putin becomes president and quietly cracks down. A vain man, he seized television channels, imprisoned media moguls who mock him or report on his government in ways he disagrees with. He eventually establishes RT, also known as Russia Today, the state-run Russian television channel. Putin is growing concerned that many countries around him are flipping into democracies. He thinks the West is behind it. Countries such as Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan.
Putin believed the West was fomenting revolutions around him to take him out. He blasts the US in a speech in Munich. Seated in the front row were Senators John McCain, Joe Lieberman, and Lindsey Graham.
2003, George W. Bush starts the Iraq War, playing into Putin's largest fear that the U.S. is doing regime change, now by force. Putin starts getting involved and starts backing candidates that are pro-Russia in various elections.
In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, a Russian-backed billionaire worth an estimated $12 billion, runs for president in Ukraine. Western intel states he's backed by Putin. Yanukovych runs on the idea of getting along with Russia.
But getting along with Russia would be a good thing, not a bad thing.
Running on the pro-Western ticket is a guy named Viktor Yushchenko, and he has an administrator named Yulia Tymoshenko. These names will get confusing, but we'll do our best to differentiate. The administrator, Tymoshenko, tells Western intelligence officials she's very worried about her running mate Yushchenko and feels his life is in danger. Within a few months, Yushchenko is poisoned and his face is horribly disfigured in the attack. He spends a few months in the hospital recovering. Eventually, he goes back out on the campaign trail, and many suspect that the Russians were behind the attack. Yushchenko and Tymoshenko lose the election, and many in Ukraine feel that the election has been tampered with. They begin to protest wearing road construction-like orange jackets. It becomes known as the Orange Revolution. The Ukrainian parliament decides to nullify the election and redo it. This time, Yushchenko beats Yanukovych, the Russian-backed candidate. Yanukovych decides he needs a new image. He hires an American consultant to help with his image and pays him $600,000 a month. The American's name is Paul Manafort.
So to be clear, Mr. Trump has no financial relationships with any Russian oligarchs.
That's what he said. That's what I said. That's obviously what our position is.
In 2007, Russia starts a cyber war with the former Soviet Republic of Estonia. There's a great deal of civic unrest and disinformation. The unrest is largely due to the removal of a statue, a Soviet-era statue, which many claim is part of their heritage. Many protesters chant pro-Russia chants in the streets.
Russia is our friend. The South will rise again. Russia is our friend. The South will rise again.
That video there was in Charlottesville. Russia takes out their internet and shuts off the power in a cyber attack, causing panic and chaos. In 2008, Russia invades the country of Georgia during the same time as the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. The president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, was pushing Georgia to join NATO at the time. For months, Russia had been provoking them to war. The war goes poorly for Putin. Russian forces are pushed back, and Putin is shunned by Western forces at the G20 summit. Putin begins a nationalist campaign inside Georgia and lines up a candidate. This starts pushing Georgia to the right. They become very anti-immigrant within certain factions of the political right. Russia then backs a man named Ivanishvili from a party that its calling card is, quote, Defend Georgia.
America first.
The candidate is a Georgian businessman with ties to Russia and worth an estimated $4.9 billion, who also calls for Georgia to get along with Russia. What turns out to be a fake video shows Saakashvili's government beating people in prison. Ivanishvili spreads a rumor that Saakashvili wasn't born in Georgia. He's secretly an Armenian, which is to say he wasn't born here and is secretly a Muslim.
I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not.
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about.
Ivanishvili also spreads rumor that no matter what the outcome, the election is rigged and can't be trusted if Saakashvili's government is the one conducting it.
Hillary is running for president in what looks like a rigged election, okay? It looks to me like a rigged election.
Meanwhile, Obama is elected and wishes to reset talks with Putin. It doesn't go well, and Putin unloads all his grievances, which tells Obama that Putin is still hung up on the past. The Arab Spring takes off, primarily due to Facebook and other social media platforms. Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, and later Libya start to show signs the people are wanting to change and become democratic countries and join the market economy.
Putin is convinced that the U.S. is fomenting liberal democracies around him.
Hillary spearheads the Libya operations and works behind the scenes negotiating with rebel leaders looking to oust Gaddafi. She gets Obama and Western forces to implement a no-fly zone. Hillary Clinton is handed a phone before a 60 Minutes interview with news that Gaddafi is dead. She remarks,
"We came, we saw, he died."
This greatly terrified Putin. Clinton had been running point in Libya, and anything and everything that goes wrong is laid at her doorstep by both political rivals at home and abroad. As Syria starts to shake from democratic revolt, Putin steps in to help Assad.
2009, Ukraine. Tymoshenko is now the prime minister. The Russians supply a majority of the natural gas to the EU. 80% of their supply comes from 4 lines that runs through Ukraine. The other 20% comes from a line that runs from Russia through Turkey. Putin begins to manipulate the flow of the gas to the EU. He turns it down and raises the price. At one point, he shuts it off in the dead of winter. This forces Tymoshenko to make a deal with Putin to get the gas restored. Yanukovych, fresh from his Manafort makeover, runs for president in Ukraine again. He's running on the idea that Tymoshenko is bad for Ukraine. He points to the deal with Russia as evidence, even though Yanukovych is largely seen as the Russian-backed candidate. Yanukovych refuses to participate in a debate with Tymoshenko, so she does the debate alone.
So most likely, I won't be doing the debate.
Yanukovych wins the election and investigates the gas deal. Many Ukrainians, angered over the deal, chant "Lock her up" in the streets. Yanukovych holds a fake trial and throws Tymoshenko in prison. Meanwhile, Manafort is going back and forth from Ukraine to his home in Trump Tower.
It's 2011. Vladimir Putin gets re-elected. Many in Moscow are now armed with smartphones. They film ballot boxes almost full when the polls are first opened, indicating that the election is being falsified. They capture state officials filling out blank ballots. The videos go viral. 100,000 Russians take to the streets of Moscow. One critic is particularly outspoken about the election in Moscow and calls it a false election repeatedly.
Russian voters deserve a full investigation of all credible reports of electoral fraud and manipulation.
This claim infuriated Putin. Putin once again blames America for interfering and causing the protests, which they clearly did not. Putin cracks down brutally. Journalists begin getting killed. Critics are arrested and given long sentences. Opposition leaders get killed, and Putin-style order is restored. Putin then swears to get revenge on Hillary.
Shortly thereafter, Yanukovych backs Ukraine out of an agreement with the EU after speaking with Putin. From the BBC, quote, "Last week, Mr. Yanukovych announced he was suspending preparations for signing an association agreement in Vilnius, which would have opened borders to goods and set the stage for travel restrictions to be eased," end quote. His stated reasoning was that he didn't wish to ruin trade relations with the Russians. Ukraine sees he's in Putin's pocket, and they take to the streets. The police break up the camp. They open fire on protesters in Maidan Square and kill over 100 people. This solidifies opposition to Yanukovych. Yanukovych escapes Ukraine in the middle of the night and flies to Russia, where he is welcomed by Vladimir Putin. Parliament releases Tymoshenko, and shortly thereafter, Putin invades Chechnya, knowing it's now or never. Not long after, Russian separatists down a Malaysian airliner, killing over 290 people with a Soviet and now Russian-made Buk missile. The US and EU hit Russia immensely hard with sanctions. Discussions of easing these sanctions are the subject of later inquiry by the Special Counsel's Office with members of Trump's campaign team. January 2019, from The Guardian. A Ukrainian court has found the former president, Viktor Yanukovych, guilty of treason for his efforts to crush the 2014 pro-Western demonstration that eventually toppled his government. Yanukovych was also charged with asking Vladimir Putin to send troops to invade Ukraine after he had fled the country. The verdict came almost 5 years after Yanukovych was overthrown and could serve as an important symbolic conclusion to the events of 2014. More than 100 people were killed, many by sniper fire, on Kiev's Maidan Square in clashes between protesters and police. The charges will have little real effect on Yanukovych, 68, who has lived in exile in the Russian city of Rostov since fleeing Ukraine under armed guard nearly 5 years ago. Josh, all of that's very disturbing stuff, and I want to give a little bit more recent, examples of sort of a Trump-Russia connection. Vladimir Putin, just a few weeks ago, the Reuters reported that he said that windmills kill birds.
Right.
And we all know that we've heard that before. He said that liberal democracy is dead. And he pointed to the immigrants entering into the EU as proof that liberalism is dead, because they are allowing immigrants to come in to their countries and commit crime and rape with impunity, which sounds exactly like what Donald Trump was saying during his presidential launch. Complicating this is the Brexit situation, and they're about to pull out of the EU. And we learned that some of Boris Johnson's cabinet picks are former Sky Media executives who worked for Rupert Murdoch's Sky Media before it was sold to Comcast. And now they're sitting in the Prime Minister's office, clearly still having that connection with Rupert Murdoch. And then lastly, Murdoch was questioned, and he denies saying this, but somebody asked him, why do you hate the EU so much? And he said, when I go to Downing Street, they do what I say. When I go to Brussels, no one seems to care. So I know this sounds like a conspiracy theory type of topic, but conspiracy theories usually aren't plastered all over the New York Times and the BBC, right? There's not a treasure trove of documentation to prove conspiracy theories. That's what makes them conspiracy theories. Right? This one is, to me, I'm seeing the connection in all of this be climate change. If your chief export to the EU is natural gas, every solar panel that goes up, every windmill that goes up is going to mean a reduction in your revenue. If you are transitioning to electric cars, that's going to affect the Saudi government. And all of these countries that export fossil fuels, they all seem to be run by dictators who Donald Trump goes around and shakes their hands.
It's interesting you mentioned that about the EU, because they also, they have quite a head start on us. You look at
France, Germany, they have 10 years before we have, they made a concerted national effort to push for green energy. There's nations that are a fraction the size of the United States who have more solar farm that have, it's interesting, Vice actually, I think, did a documentary on how it said, like, why the heck are there so many Teslas in Sweden, and they have, like, some government program or whatever, but their goal was basically, like, let's go electric, and especially for a nation like Russia, where by far your number one export, like your entire, people hear climate change and they probably either really agreed, or there might be a few listeners who think, oh, the liberals going on, climate change. It's like, no, this isn't just climate change. Like, Vladimir Putin knows that, like you said, with every windmill that goes up, it's a loss in dollars. And it could, if America itself specifically, such a big consumer, if we said, you know what, screw Russia, screw the, Saudis, screw, all these oil imports, we're going to really commit and go solar within 5 years.
Right, yeah.
The Russian economy would be irreversibly tanked.
Yeah, and that's what he fears, right? Mm-hmm. So if you put yourself into Putin's shoes, he's seeing a partnership between the West and the EU and UK. And that partnership is saying we are going to transition to clean, renewable energy. And he says, how do I, as a former Soviet counterintelligence officer, spread disinformation and make these countries hate each other? Mm-hmm. He's going to need to divide them on racial lines, on religious lines, on immigration lines, and scare them into focusing on their own problems and finding internally. And he needs a lever to do that. And if that leverage is highly compromised and the Russians have information on that person, then that person's actions of, let's say, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord makes perfect sense. And when he slaps tariffs upon our EU allies, that makes perfect sense. And when he puts tariffs on China, and China starts to shift its trade to Russia, that makes perfect sense, right? And then to top it all off, when you have a news organization in the United States that is providing both shade to that operation and employees to that operation in both the EU, or rather the UK and the US, I mean, it's hard for it not to sound like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's funny you mention that, because it's almost like everything he creates as a problem that we face it's funny how it's either not a problem they face, or, for instance, what I mean is, like, okay, so we highlighted, energy, green energy. He almost perpetuates this myth that it's going to kill jobs, when we know...
You're talking Murdoch, not Putin.
Well, I mean, technically both, because if you look at, like, the bots and the social media accounts and everything, but the immigrant rhetoric, we know, and we discussed previously, that he views the golden days, Putin, as, the pre-Berlin Wall, Soviet Union, and...
the heyday.
Yeah, the heyday. And there was an interview with a group, this was in the 90s, a panel with a group of former Soviets who just, regular working class people. And one of them said, it was an interview conducted by, gosh, I'm blanking her name. She was the Secretary of State during Clinton's years.
Madeleine Albright?
Yes, Madeleine Albright. And she said this one guy stood up and said, because she said, you have democracy now. And this guy stood up and said, we used to be a superpower. Now we're Bangladesh with nukes. And that, I think, highlighted the crux of, like, probably how Putin looks at things. The Berlin Wall comes down right before we have the biggest economic boom with the Silicon Valley, Silicon chip in the 90s, that just went wild and helped so many people. And not only that, with the immigrant thing, how many people have you heard of who are just lined up desperately trying to get into Russia?
Yeah.
There are neighboring countries in far worse economic shape than Russia, and the people there have no interest. Like, this is speculative. I will, say that as a caveat. But imagine seeing like the nations you hate, United States, Western Europe, where people are desperately trying to get in. It's almost like the feeling a lot of Americans have with the reason I think this has been effective for Putin is it has a similar feeling a lot of Americans have with the elitist, populist, globalist, politicians, is they feel left behind. Russia has been left behind. They used to be a superpower, and now they're Bangladesh with nukes, and
But
so
we
every
can't-
issue.
Yeah, and we can't look at Russia being left behind with a great deal of sympathy.
Right.
And the U.S. and the West never has. They see a criminal organization at the top running their major export, cheating within the markets, killing journalists, killing opposition leaders. Right now there's riots in Moscow because opposition party members are not allowed to run in elections against Putin's party. Right. There's no sympathy towards Putin. I have sympathy for the people of Russia.
Right.
But not for Putin and his regime.
Yeah, it's like the reason he fell behind, it's like if he embraced democracy, he could be almost neck and neck with maybe not us, but a lot of the growth of Western European nations we've seen and everything, and they could be doing well. They have some brilliant engineers and brilliant people who could have probably come up with the next big green energy thing. They could have, if they really embraced it, but you have a leader who looks back at his days with the KGB before the Berlin Wall, like the height, and he just cannot let go of that. He cannot let go of the fact that he looks at us, and we not only defeat him in the Cold War, but we followed up with NATO, and it's almost like the double whammy, and he feels it's almost like the death by 1,000 cuts. He's on the 999th cut, and he's not going down without a fight.
I want to go back to something you were talking about. The PBS Frontline, they do those documentaries. There was one where they were talking about Putin's rise to power. And there's this great story about Bill Clinton going to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin for the first time. It was like in 1999 or something. And he sits down and he very quickly realizes that this guy is no good. And before he leaves, he makes an appointment. And the motorcade takes him to Yeltsin's house. And he's sitting down with Yeltsin, and Yeltsin and Clinton were relatively good friends. And Clinton tells Yeltsin, I'm very worried about this Putin guy. And Yeltsin says, why? I don't understand. And Clinton literally reached over and tapped Yeltsin on the sternum and said, I don't think he has democracy in his heart. If you're trying to cut into the European market or the Chinese market for trade, and you have now these bullet points, right. Oh, look at the U.S. They're pulling out of the Nuclear Arms Treaty. They're pulling out of the Human Rights Council. They're pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. They're pulling out of the Iran deal. They're slapping tariffs on their allies. You can't trust the U.S. Right. Oh, they go on and on about human rights, but they have children locked in cages on the border. Mm-hmm. This is stuff that Putin is using to solidify opposition to the United States. And Trump is the one going around doing it. So whether you think he colluded or didn't collude or whatever, you have to look at his foreign policy and link it to Putin's. And if they're not colluding, they're certainly swimming side by side in perfect unison.
I mean, look at how already the tension has, climbed, escalated, and pulling out of that nuclear deal absolutely plays into his hand. And I was explaining to our friend, think of it this way: when you have that nuclear deal, whether you love Obama or hate him, whether you love the deal or not, the terms, there are still both our intelligence officials, there are, Western European neutral, there are people with our best interests in mind on the ground in Iran monitoring, and it makes it harder for Russia to send weapons, money, all of that into Iran. The moment we pull out, there are fewer people keeping an eye out. That plays into it. It's almost like every foreign policy in some way, shape, or form that we have adopted with President Trump. The reason they do have this love affair, this connection, and with Rupert Murdoch, kind of either turning a blind eye or promoting some misinformation is because it's like every policy.
Well, the other thing about Rupert, his organization is the number one disseminator of incorrect information on climate change. Bar none. He is solely responsible for creating the idea that scientists are divided on it. And here's the thing. We did a different episode where I cut this for time, but I said, if you're somebody who doesn't think climate change is real or man-made, at this point in the game, it's not because you can't understand or don't understand it. It's because you're choosing not to understand it. There's a phrase that says, in the information age, ignorance is a choice. And if you're not looking up this stuff on climate change to see how impactful it's going to be, it's just because you have chosen not to.
Right.
But on top of that, the fact that he has created that delusion that there's all this skepticism about it. It's kind of like saying, some lawyers feel that premeditated murder is not a crime. Are we holding out for unanimous consent on whether or not it's a crime?
Right.
Are we holding out on unanimous consent as to whether or not climate change is happening? So, Josh, we could probably talk all day about this topic, but I just want to know, where does this leave us?
This issue is not about Democrats versus Republicans. This is not about going into that kind of rhetoric or, Obama colluded with him first. This issue is, think of it this way, one of the most anti-democracy and anti-capitalist world leaders now has his hand on the steering wheel of our country, the steering wheel of what drives our nation. So the question is, are we just going to let Russia defeat us while we fight amongst each other? Or are we going to take a stand and fight back against someone like Vladimir Putin and defend our country that the founding fathers fought so hard to establish?
Hear, hear. Listeners, we just wanted to take a moment and thank you for listening to It Might Be Interesting.
We know we have quite a few loyal listeners, and we'd love hearing your feedback and comments. So please send us your feedback at thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. And also, please feel free to share an episode with friends and family.
We hope that when you do, they too will find it interesting. Thank you again, and we'll be back next week with more content that we find interesting.